It was the kind of August morning that clings to the skin, thick with heat and heavy with silence. The year was 1892, and the streets of Fall River, Massachusetts, buzzed with the usual churn of life, the metallic rattle of carts on cobblestones, the hum of mill whistles, and the muffled cries of overworked children trailing behind their mothers. Yet, inside a modest home on 2nd Street, a darkness had begun to stir. It breathed beneath the floorboards and whispered between the walls, a slow, seeping poison no one dared name. The house belonged to the Hennessy family, one of the old Yankee clans whose fortunes had once ridden proudly on the backs of whaling ships and maritime trade. But times were changing. The sea no longer yielded riches. Instead, the city's future belonged to the mill's great belching factories of brick and smoke where Irish and French-Canadian immigrants labored themselves to the bone. Still, the Hennessys held tight to their status, their property, and their past. Their home stood like a relic, old, dignified, and slightly out of step with the new world pressing in around it. Andrew Hennessy, the patriarch, was a man carved out of New England granite. At 70, he retained a severe frame and sharp steel-colored eyes that could silence a man with a glance. He had made his early wealth in the coffin business, an irony no reporter could resist later on, and had since grown it through property dealings and factory investments. But while he commanded respect, it was never affection. His tenants feared him, his business partners endeared him, and his family barely tolerated him. Abby Hennessy, Andrew's second wife, had been married to him for nearly 3 decades. Their union was never romantic, it was practical, perhaps even transactional. She was a broad-shouldered, tight-laced woman whose graying hair was pulled back so severely it seemed to pull her whole face taut. In conversation, she was precise and brisk, always careful to maintain her place in the social order. Andrew's daughters from his first marriage, Ma and Lizzie, never called her mother, only Mrs. Hennessy, a subtle cruelty that had hardened into ritual over the years. Emma Hennessy, the elder daughter at 41, had long since retreated from the world. She moved through the house with the slow-footed gloom of someone resigned to her station. Life had passed her by, and she had not chased after it. Lizzie, on the other hand, had claws. At 32, unmarried and unapologetically sharp, she radiated a restlessness that disturbed the quiet rhythm of the household. She read voraciously, spoke defiantly at church meetings, and held opinions, dangerous ones, on suffrage and inheritance rights. Her father found her ideas unbecoming. Society found them unladylike. And then there was Bridget O'Malley. Bridget had arrived from County Cork 3 years earlier with little more than a tattered suitcase and a letter of reference from a parish priest. She was 25 and invisible, in the way servants often are, present in every room but never truly seen. Her rough hands scrubbed, folded, and swept. Her lips remained sealed. She knew her place, or at least, she had convinced herself she did. She watched the family closely, not out of curiosity, but survival. She understood that knowledge was a kind of armor, and in that house, with its daily silences and glances weighted with unspoken things, armor was necessary. She had seen the tension between the daughters and their stepmother, sharp and jagged like shards beneath a rug. She had heard the muffled fights behind closed doors, and lately, the air itself had started to feel different, like something was winding tighter and tighter, ready to snap. The summer had been brutal. Labor strikes in nearby towns, whispers of violence, and political unrest. The mills were a tinderbox, and inside the Hennessy house, the same kind of heat was building. Lizzie had grown bolder in her confrontations with Andrew. Neighbors reported raised voices that stretched long into the night. Bridget pretended not to hear, but she heard everything. She knew that Andrew had recently changed his will. She knew that Lizzie and Emma had been left far less than they'd expected. She also knew that Lizzie had been going through her father's documents, digging through drawers and locked cabinets when she thought no one was watching. Bridget had seen her once half in shadow, fingers smudged with dust, eyes burning. Then, on the evening of August 3rd, an unexpected guest arrived. John Desmond, Abby's brother-in-law, came through the door with nervous energy and the smell of travel on his coat. He said he was in town for business, but even Bridget could tell he wasn't telling the whole truth. She caught snatches of whispered conversations about property transfers and legal documents. His presence made everyone uneasy. The house, already teetering, felt on the verge of collapse. The next morning, August 4th, dawned thick with humidity, the kind of day that makes tempers short and air hard to breathe. Bridget rose before the sun, as she always did, to light the kitchen fire and prepare breakfast. Her mind was elsewhere. The night's voices, the secrets she wasn't meant to hear, clung to her like cobwebs. Breakfast was quiet, too quiet. Mr. Hennessy sat reading his paper with a scowl, chewing day-old bread like it had wronged him. Abby moved like someone trying not to spill a glass of water. Desmond picked at his food and stared at nothing. Lizzie was the last to arrive, her face flushed, her eyes unreadable. Bridget, from her corner in the kitchen, watched her like a cat watches a snake. She's been asking about the will again, Abby whispered to Desmond, not softly enough. Bridget filed it away. Then, like clockwork, Desmond made his exit to visit relatives. Mr. Hennessy left shortly after to check on his properties. Abby busied herself with the guest room upstairs. Lizzie disappeared down the hall. Bridget gathered her cleaning supplies and moved to the east windows. The house fell into a deceptive stillness. Outside, the neighborhood stirred to life, milkmen calling out their routes, children chasing hoops in the dust. But within those walls, the story was already unfolding, the first page of a blood-soaked narrative no one would be able to close for generations. At 9:17 a.m., Bridget heard the first scream. It was short, sharp, and horribly human. She froze, her soapy cloth slipping from her fingers. She waited nothing then. A second scream, longer, filled with unmistakable terror, cut through the silence like a blade. This time, Bridget didn't hesitate. She dropped everything and turned toward the back door, her heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in years, fear. Bridget hesitated at the threshold of the back door, her fingers trembling against the iron handle. The screams still echoed inside her skull, high-pitched, desperate, and unlike anything she'd heard in her 3 years at the Hennessy house. It wasn't the kind of cry one makes from surprise or anger. No, this was something raw, primordial. It came from the depths of someone who suddenly realizes they're not going to live. The sun was now climbing, casting harsh light across the east side of the house. The windows she'd been washing moments ago still glistened with soap streaks and half-finished effort. Her apron stuck to her back. The kitchen behind her remained still, save for the quiet hiss of a kettle about to boil. She stood there, caught between a world she understood and one she now feared stepping into. Another moment passed. The silence that followed the second scream was somehow worse. It wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. Clutching the folds of her apron, Bridget stepped inside. Her feet felt heavy on the polished wood floors as she moved toward the staircase, heart thudding harder with every step. She moved slowly, deliberately. The Hennessy household had rules, ones about how a servant should behave, how she should walk, speak, exist. But now, all that seemed hollow. She reached the base of the staircase and paused. The hall stretched before her, dim and still, with only the ticking of the parlor clock cutting through the hush. Morning light filtered through lace curtains, turning the hallway into a tunnel of shadows and fractured gold. Something smelled odd, metallic, wet, sweet in a way that turned her stomach. The guest room door at the top of the stairs hung slightly ajar. Her voice, when she found it, came out soft and cracking. "Mrs. Hennessy, ma'am." No reply. The air was thick. Each step upward felt like climbing through molasses. At the top, the hallway narrowed. She glanced toward Lizzie's room. The door was closed. She turned toward the guest room and pushed the door open gently, and then she saw it. Abby Hennessy lay face down beside the bed, her gray house dress soaked in blood that had already begun to congeal in pools on the hardwood floor. Her skull was no longer a skull, it was a shattered landscape of bone, pulp, and hair matted with gore. One arm was bent unnaturally beneath her, the other stretched out toward the bedpost, fingers twisted as if in mid. The floral wallpaper behind her had been splattered in an abstract chaos of red, an accidental mural of violence. Bridget's knees buckled. She grabbed the doorframe for balance as bile rose in her throat. But it wasn't just the sight. It was the smell, that sickly, sweet scent of blood and death, thick as syrup in the air. She had never been to a slaughterhouse, but she imagined this was what one must feel like, where the body stopped being a person and became something else. Something meat-like. And in the far corner of the room, framed by the morning light, stood Lizzie Hennessy. Still, silent, staring. She held the axe in her gloved hands, not a large axe, but small, for chopping kindling. Yet its blade was slick, its wood handle spotted with blood. Her shirtwaist was pure white, untouched by the mess that surrounded her. Her hair was arranged neatly, not a strand out of place. But it was her eyes that froze Bridget in place. Eyes not wild with madness, but cool, resolved, as though the act she'd just committed had been scheduled. "She fell," Lizzie said, her voice flat. "Poor dear, must have slipped." Bridget's mouth opened. No sound came. Lizzie took a step forward. "You're going to help me, Bridget." The servant backed against the wall. "If you don't," Lizzie continued, "they'll say you did this." Bridget blinked. "What?" "You heard me." Lizzie's voice lowered, but her intensity sharpened. "You're the Irish maid. You're the Irish maid." We're alone in the house. No family, no friends, no one to vouch for you. If you scream, if you tell anyone what you saw, you'll hang or rot in a prison with rats for company. But if you help me, this will go away." Bridget felt the air shift. Time dilated. Her world narrowed to a single thought: survival. What do you want me to do?" Lizzie exhaled softly, like a teacher satisfied with a student's answer. "We wait," she said. "Father will be home soon. Then we finish this." What followed was not real life. It was theater. A silent, grotesque performance carried out in the belly of that house. Lizzie moved with an eerie calm. She brought the axe to the wash basin, scrubbing it carefully with lye and hot water, her hands precise, detached. She peeled off her gloves, folded them neatly, and changed her dress. Placing the bloodied garments into a laundry bag she later carried down to the cellar. Every action was intentional, practiced. She returned to Abby's body, repositioned it slightly, and covered part of the head with a shawl. From the doorway, the violence was no longer as obvious. She closed the door gently and turned the key. Bridget hadn't moved from the hall. "You understand now, don't you?" Lizzie asked, drying her hands. She was poisoning this family, turning father against us, against his own blood. Would have left us with nothing. Nothing. Her voice cracked then, only slightly. For a moment her composure flickered. Her hands trembled as she dried them. Her eyes flicked toward the guest room. Then, as if remembering herself, she straightened her shoulders. By 11 a.m., Andrew Hennessy returned. The front door opened with its usual groan, his boots thunking against the floorboards. "Abby," he called, "help me with my coat." No reply. Lizzie descended the stairs with the serenity of a dutiful daughter. "She left earlier," she said smoothly. "A messenger came. Mrs. Churchill is ill. She said she might be gone until this evening." Andrew grunted and dropped into his armchair, newspapers under one arm. Within minutes he had fallen asleep, snoring gently. Bridget watched from the kitchen as Lizzie crept back upstairs, not to her room, but to the cellar. When she emerged, the axe was again hidden in the folds of her dress. Bridget's voice died in her throat. Lizzie stepped into the sitting room. The first blow was swift and silent. Andrew's eyes opened for a split second, then glazed. The second split his face. The third shattered his temple. And when Lizzie was finished, the only sound in the room was her breath, fast, heavy, and victorious. She turned to Bridget. "Now," she said, "we scream." The scream Lizzie let out was nothing short of masterful. It burst from her throat like a carefully rehearsed aria, high, trembling, and just unhinged enough to sound genuine. Bridget stood frozen in the kitchen, heart hammering as the cry echoed, off the walls, out the open windows, and into the quiet morning street. Within moments, voices stirred outside. A neighbor's dog barked. Someone called out. Lizzie collapsed dramatically onto the front lawn, her white dress fluttering around her like a fallen angel's robe. Her sobs came in rhythm, loud, gasping, desperate. "Help! Help! My father, oh God! Someone please!" The neighbors came running, slippers slapping on cobblestones, eyes wide and curious. Mrs. Parker from across the street arrived first, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth as she peered into the sitting room. She recoiled instantly, her face turning pale. More arrived. Mr. Wellen, the newspaper boy, even the postmaster's wife. Inside the house, Bridget remained where she had stood, her arms limp at her sides. Her hands were still wet from scrubbing. The scent of blood mixed with the fading tenth of lye clung to the air, sticking to the back of her throat like smoke. She wanted to scream, to cry, to confess everything, but Lizzie's words rang in her ears like a curse. "If you don't help me, they'll say you did it." She didn't need to imagine the consequences. She had seen enough of America to know how people looked at Irish maids. Disposable, criminal, unclean. A scandal like this too. Murdered Protestant elites and a terrified, undocumented servant. The trial would be quick. The verdict inevitable, so she did what she had been trained to do. She obeyed. Bridget stepped into the sitting room, wiping her hands on her apron, feigning shock. "Sweet Lord," she whispered, though her voice came out hollow. She turned away quickly and ran for the back door, calling toward the neighbors. "We need a doctor. Call the constable." A few men bolted down the road. Soon, Fall River would descend upon the Hennessy home like flies on a carcass. By noon, the house was swarming with lawmen, medics, and reporters in wide-brimmed hats, scribbling notes. Detective Charles Mallory arrived from Boston by 2 p.m., summoned personally by the local chief who felt his department was in over its head. Mallory was a slim man with a receding hairline and eyes that missed nothing. He entered the parlor with quiet detachment, observed the mess that had once been Andrew Hennessy, and then slowly turned toward the pale, weeping woman on the chaise. "Miss Hennessy," he said gently, "would you walk me through your morning?" Lizzie dabbed her eyes and launched into her story. Her voice quivered in all the right places. She had been upstairs in the barn loft, retrieving old linens, when she heard a terrible scream. She rushed down and found her father. The horror. She had run to fetch help at once. Her stepmother, or she'd left earlier that morning, summoned to aid a sick friend, Mrs. Churchill. A note had arrived by messenger. Mallory's brow furrowed. "Do you have the note?" "No," Lizzie said. I threw it away. I didn't think I'd need to keep it. And this messenger, did anyone else see him?" She paused, just briefly. "Bridget did. Ask her." Mallory turned to Bridget, who stood near the doorway, arms tight against her sides. "Is that true, Miss O'Malley? Did you see a messenger deliver a note this morning?" Bridget hesitated. Every word felt like a step off a cliff. "Yes," she whispered. "He handed her something. I didn't see his face." It was a lie, but not the last one she'd tell. That evening, the coroner's initial report confirmed what most already suspected. Both victims had been murdered with the same small axe, likely within 2 hours of each other. The wounds on Andrew Hennessy's body matched those found on his wife upstairs. The time of death estimates lined up with the supposed comings and goings Lizzie described, but just barely. The parlor was sealed. Reporters circled like vultures. Neighbors whispered in fear and fascination. A double murder in their town, in broad daylight, and not just anyone, the Hennessy. The questions came fast and hard. Where was Mrs. Hennessy? Why had no one seen her leave? Why did no one recall a messenger? And where was the axe? That question was answered quickly. Detective Mallory found it himself, still wet, hidden behind the cellar's laundry chute beneath a pile of old blankets. Its blade gleamed in the lantern light, smelling faintly of soap and something else, something coppery. This wasn't the work of an outsider, he muttered to himself. No forced entry, no disarray. He looked again at Lizzie, now surrounded by consoling friends and community figures. She wept like a woman who had lost everything, but he saw through tears. He always did. The next morning, Mrs. Hennessy's body was discovered. Bridget had played her part well, helping Lizzie maintain the fiction that Abby had simply gone out and never returned. But the house couldn't keep that secret much longer. The stench of death had begun to rise through the upstairs floorboards. Detective Mallory was there when the guest room was unlocked. Even his veteran heart skipped a beat. Abby Hennessy's corpse, decomposing in the August heat, lay twisted beside the bed. The blow marks were horrific. Blood had soaked through the floorboards. Her head barely resembled something human. Lizzie collapsed theatrically. No, not her too, not both. Bridget remained silent. Her hands were trembling again. Mallory watched the young maid closely. Something was wrong. Later that evening, Mallory approached Bridget in the kitchen, where she sat scrubbing a pan that was already clean. "Miss O'Malley," he said softly, "I know what shock looks like. You're not in shock, you're in fear." She said nothing. He sat across from her, setting his notebook aside. "I don't want to trap you. I don't want to hurt you. I want to understand. But if you know something, and I believe you do, every hour you stay quiet makes you more vulnerable." Bridget stared at her hands. "I didn't see anything," she said automatically. "I've been doing this a long time," he replied. "You didn't see nothing. You saw too much." Their eyes met for a moment. Something passed between them, recognition maybe, of fear, of knowledge. But the mask held. "For now," Bridget said. "That's all I have to say." Mallory stood, nodded, and left her in silence. That night, the wind picked up. Clouds swept in from the harbor. Thunder rolled somewhere far away. And inside the house on 2nd Street, 3 women lay awake. One wept into her pillow. One stared at the ceiling, counting lies like sheep, and one, behind a locked door, sat silently at her vanity, polishing her fingernails in the dim glow of a gas lamp, humming a lullaby under her breath. The newspapers wasted no time. By the following morning, the Fall River Herald had already christened the crime the 2nd Street slaughter. Headlines screamed of murder in high society. Columns overflowed with speculation, colorful character sketches, and exaggerated accounts of Lizzie's tragic fainting spells and Bridget's mysterious silence. Within 2 days, reporters from Boston and New York had arrived, notebooks in hand, eager to sniff out whatever scraps hadn't yet been printed. But behind the ink and hysteria, inside the house itself, the atmosphere had turned suffocating. Bridget felt it most acutely. The air seemed thicker, the walls closer, time slowed and blurred, days bleeding into nights, without clear beginning or end. Lizzie floated through the halls like a ghost in crisp collars and starched skirts, always calm, always composed. Her eyes, however, had changed still. Bright, still sharp, but colder now, more calculating. She rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Every word, every look, was loaded with implication. "Thank you for setting the table, Bridget," she said sweetly one evening. "It's so comforting to have someone trustworthy in the house." Bridget flinched at the compliment. Emma Hennessy, meanwhile, drifted on the fringes. She had returned from her visit to a cousin in Taunton 3 days after the murders. Just as the papers were reaching a fever pitch, her grief was real but subdued. She kept mostly to her room, claiming headaches, taking tea in silence, and when she did speak, it was in whispers. Even her eyes avoided Bridget's. On the surface, the household carried on. Meals were cooked, curtains were drawn, laundry hung neatly in the back garden as if nothing had happened. But beneath that thin veneer of routine, something was unraveling. Detective Mallory knew it too. In his career he had seen plenty of bloodshed, plenty of mayhem, but this house unsettled him. It wasn't just the murders, it was the aftermath of performance. There was something too neat about it, something deliberate. He carried with him a notebook, always half-filled, always dog-eared at the corner. In it, he'd begun assembling a list. Not facts, those were for the report. This was a different kind of record. One of feelings, impressions, inconsistencies. Things that don't add up. No forced entry, no sign of struggle in either murder. Axe cleaned and hidden inside the house. Abby killed over an hour before Andrew murderer waited inside. Why, Lizzie's clothes clean, yet proximity to both scenes was undeniable. Bridget's testimony, too neat, too memorized. The note from the messenger vanished. Desmond's visit, timed too perfectly. He left before it happened. Or did he? He returned to the Hennessy house on the 3rd day after the murders, this time without uniformed officers or photographers. He wanted a quieter look. Lizzie met him at the door with a tired smile. "Detective," she said, "any progress?" "A few threads. Still trying to stitch them together. You'll let us know, of course, if there's anything new." "Of course," he said. They stood there in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, a subtle battle of wills behind polite smiles. Then he stepped past her into the house. Bridget was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes. Her hands moved mechanically. When she saw Mallory, her shoulders tensed. "Miss O'Malley," he said gently, "might we speak again?" "I've nothing new to tell, sir." "I thought that might be your answer," he replied, pulling a chair. "But I'll ask anyway." He didn't press her this time. He asked about her journey from Cork, about her work at the Hennessy house, about what she remembered of August 4th. She answered every question with practiced ease. But when he asked, casually, "Do you remember what Abby was wearing that morning?" her answer faltered. "Grey dress," she said, "the one with the small brass buttons down the back." He nodded slowly. "That's correct." She blinked. "I saw her at breakfast." "No," Mallory said quietly. "You said before she had already left by then, that you didn't see her at all that morning." Bridget's lips parted slightly. Mallory leaned back. "I'm not here to threaten you, you're not the one on trial. But I think you know that whatever you're covering up, it's costing you." She didn't reply, so he left her with only a question. "Do you believe she'll protect you when it no longer suits her?" That night, Lizzie appeared at Bridget's door. Her smile was slight, her voice gentle, but her eyes glinted like sharpened glass. "You spoke with Mallory again?" "Today, I did," Bridget admitted. "About what?" "About Island, about breakfast, about nothing." Lizzie nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "Good," she said. "Just be careful. You know how people like him are, always twisting things, always looking for a story that isn't there." Bridget didn't reply. She couldn't. "Don't worry," Lizzie added. "As long as we stick to the truth, we'll be fine." The unspoken word between them wasn't truth. It was loyalty, and it was rotting at the core. The next day, the postmaster approached Detective Mallory with a curious envelope. "Something odd came through," he said, handing it over, intercepted before it went out. "From Bridget O'Malley, postmarked for County Cork." Mallory opened it carefully, fingers cautious. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was tight, feminine, nervous. "Dear Mary, I cannot sleep for what I have seen. Lizzie has told me I must never speak of it, but I fear I will lose my soul if I keep this silence much longer. She killed them both, Mary. She said I'd hang if I ever told. But God help me, I can't keep it inside. Forever. He folded the letter slowly. His breath had caught somewhere in his chest. At that moment, across town, Lizzie sat in the drawing room, pen in hand, scribbling a note to their lawyer about the estate. Emma, who rarely spoke lately, watched her sister closely. She's growing nervous, Emma said finally. Bridget. She's weak, Lizzie replied without looking up, but manageable. Emma didn't answer. Lizzie turned to her. Unless you're growing nervous too. Emma's voice dropped. I keep thinking of Mother, of what she would have thought of this. She would have done the same, Lizzie snapped to protect her own. Emma looked away. In her lap, her fingers were trembling. By the end of the week, the illusion had begun to wear thin. From the outside, the Hennessy home remained a monument to order. The lawn was trimmed. The curtains were drawn at appropriate hours. Visitors were greeted with well-practiced grace. But behind the walls, the house was coming undone thread by thread, like a tightly stitched hem starting to unravel beneath pressure. No one could quite name aloud. Lizzie controlled the household with cool authority. Her movements were exact, her words measured. But to Bridget, who had once seen her only as a headstrong daughter with a sharp tongue, she now appeared different. It wasn't just that she'd killed, it was how she moved in the aftermath, untouchable, as if she were writing the story in real time, assigning everyone their lines. Bridget's own role had become unbearable. She scrubbed the same floorboards daily, as though scrubbing could erase what she'd seen. But no matter how much soap or boiling water she used, she could still smell it, blood and lie and something else, something colder that clung to her skin and her dreams. Sometimes she thought she could hear the sound of the axe, a blunt thud, just beneath the walls, just behind her ear. Emma had grown more withdrawn since her sister's murders. She floated through the house like a ghost in her own life, her words few and her presence shadowy. Bridget began to wonder if she knew more than she let on. Her eyes lingered too long, her silences seemed too heavy. One evening Bridget passed the parlor and heard Emma speaking softly to herself. At least she assumed it was to herself. I didn't ask for any of this, Emma whispered, but that doesn't mean I can stop it. Bridget paused in the hallway. She wanted to enter, to ask something, anything, but footsteps approached from the opposite end, and Lizzie's voice rang out, sharp as glass. Bridget, we'll have tea in the drawing room. The moment passed, and the truth, whatever it had been, remained, locked behind Emma's closed mouth. Detective Mallory, meanwhile, was no longer asking polite questions. He'd grown more pointed in his inquiries, more deliberate in his visits. The letter Bridget had written to her sister in Ireland remained folded in his coat pocket like a weapon he wasn't yet ready to draw. Not without confirming the final details. He needed more. And Desmond, the brother-in-law who had left the house mere hours before the murders, was his next thread. He found the man in a boarding house on the north end of Fall River, hunched over a plate of overcooked meat and watery potatoes. Desmond had aged noticeably in a matter of weeks. His coat hung looser on his shoulders, his hands trembled faintly, and he spoke in clipped syllables, like someone trying very hard not to say too much. Mr. Desmond, Mallory said without preamble, what exactly did you hear the night before the murders? Desmond looked up, his eyes darted toward the door and back again. Family talk, tense, but nothing more. You testified that you left early the next morning. I did, and you saw nothing suspicious. Desmond hesitated. Mallory leaned forward. I have a witness, he lied smoothly. Someone who says you overheard a very specific argument. About the will, about what would happen if Abby got everything and the girls were left with nothing. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Desmond sighed. She was unhinged. Lizzie the night before said she'd rather see them all dead than lose what was hers. I thought it was just talk. People say wild things in families like that. Sometimes wild things are the truth, Mallory replied. Desmond stared at his hands. I didn't know she meant it, he muttered. I didn't. That evening, Mallory returned to the Hennessy house. Lizzie welcomed him, as she always did, with grace and well-practiced poise. But there was something tight in her smile this time, a flicker of tension beneath her carefully powdered skin. Detective, she said, surely you're not here to repeat questions we've already answered. I'm here, he replied, to see how your story holds up under the weight of truth. She raised an eyebrow. Is that a threat? It's an observation. They stood, for a moment, face to face in the dim hallway. Behind Lizzie, Bridget appeared in the archway to the kitchen. Her eyes met Mallory's for just a moment, something desperate flickering there, brief as a candle in wind. Lizzie didn't see it, but Mallory did. I'd like to speak with Miss O'Malley again, he said casually. I don't see the need, Lizzie replied. It's not your decision. Her lips tightened. Of course, she said. But if you push too hard, detective, people might start to wonder why you're so eager to destroy a grieving daughter's name. Mallory smiled. And people might wonder why your name keeps circling the edge of every bloodstained detail. Bridget sat stiffly at the kitchen table, hands folded in her lap. This time, she didn't wait to be asked anything. I want to talk, she whispered. Mallory nodded and reached for his notebook. But before he could speak, Bridget raised her hand slightly. Not here, not tonight. Then when? She looked over her shoulder, then back at him, her voice barely audible. Tomorrow, after dark, the boarding house near the old stone bridge. Mallory nodded. And in that moment he knew something had shifted. The lie was cracking, the truth was waking. Upstairs, Lizzie stood in her room, watching the constable's carriage roll away from the window. Her reflection stared back at her from the vanity, still beautiful, still polished, but suddenly tired, and underneath the makeup and pin curls, something else had begun to show. A flicker of fear. For the first time, the script wasn't entirely hers. All that Saturday, clouds rolled in from the Atlantic like bruises spreading across a sky that had already taken too many punches. Fall River turned gray, then gunmetal, then coal-black, until even the noon light looked watery and weak. People said storms were coming, but storms had already arrived inside the Hennessy house. They just hadn't shown their lightning yet. But Bridget O'Malley worked the day in silence, moving from scullery to parlor like a figure in a dream she desperately wished to wake from. Each tick of the mantel clock sounded louder than the last, counting down to the moment she would slip out into the evening to meet Detective Mallory. She feared that Lizzie could hear those ticks too, feared that somehow the rhythm betrayed her. At 3 o'clock, Lizzie called for tea. The china rattled ever so slightly as Bridget set the tray on a lace doily. Lizzie's gloved fingers pinched a lemon slice with practiced delicacy, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her steel composure. "You've spent a good deal of time staring out windows today," Lizzie remarked, voice light as spun sugar. Bridget dipped her head. The sky looked strange. "I wondered if we'd have thunder." "Storms are cleansing," Lizzie said, stirring. "They wash away what shouldn't linger." Her eyes glinted, half warning, half promise. "Wouldn't you agree?" Bridget's throat dried. "I suppose." The tea tasted of secrets, scalding, bitter, and dangerous to swallow. Twilight came early, dragging a curtain of violet over the streets. Bridget finished her chores with precise efficiency, then retreated to her attic room, heart drumming. She removed her apron, donned a plain cloak, and tucked a folded scrap of paper into her bodice. Questions she could not answer, memories she could not forget, and the simplest prayer she still knew by heart. She waited until Lizzie's footsteps crossed the upstairs landing, left, right, paused, then faded. Emma's door clicked shut. The house exhaled. Now down the servants' stairwell, boots barely brushing worn treads, through the back corridor, past the pantry that still smelled faintly of lye. At the rear door she paused, hand on the knob, listening. Only the creak of branches in the breeze answered her when she stepped outside. The air felt heavier than the house she'd left behind. A low rumble rolled across the sky like distant cannon fire. She pulled the cloak tight and began the half-mile walk toward the stone bridge. Detective Mallory sat in the boarding house parlor, a single lamp burning and the letter from County Cork lying on the table like a loaded pistol. Every instinct told him he was close enough to taste metal in the back of his mouth. But instinct was one thing, proof was another, and proof had a way of slipping through fingers when a jury refused to see. A soft knock. The landlady opened the door. Bridget stepped inside, cloak dripping with fog. The dim lamplight caught her eyes, terrified but resolved. Like someone who had decided drowning was worse than swimming through storm water, he rose. "Thank you for coming." No one followed. She whispered, "Sit, please, let's talk." She remained standing. "I have only one promise from you, detective. If I speak, you must keep me safe." Safe from her hand, safe from what people will say. "I'll do everything in my power," he said, "but I can't protect you from the truth once it's spoken." She drew a breath that shuddered. "Then so be it." Words tumbled out in a low, urgent stream. She began with the first scream, then the second. How she'd found Abby's body. How Lizzie had stood there with the axe eyes calm, blade red. How she'd been forced into silence, threatened with rope and prejudice and every cruelty the city could dream for an Irish girl. Mallory scribbled as fast as the pen allowed, pausing only when her voice faltered. She said they'd blame me." "They won't," he replied. "You don't know Fall River," Bridget muttered. "You don't know how they look at us." He did know, or thought he did, but he also knew the law could be bent under the right leverage. He would bend it if he had to. "Tell me about Emma," he said. Bridget hesitated. Emma sees more than she lets on. I think she's afraid of Lizzie, same as I am. But there's guilt on her face, guilt that doesn't belong to me. Could she have helped? I don't know," Bridget whispered. "Some nights I hear them talking. Emma pleads. Lizzie instructs. I can't hear the words, only the shape of fear in Emma's voice. Mallory set his pen down. Thunder rattled the window panes. We'll need your sworn statement, he said, and we'll need Emma. Bridget's head snapped up. She'll never speak against her sister. Maybe she doesn't have to, he answered. Maybe she only has to confirm what she heard. Sometimes a whisper in the right ear is louder than a shout. Back at 2nd Street, Emma sat alone in her bedroom, a single candle melting itself toward darkness. In her hand lay a telegram she had never meant to keep, its edges frayed from nervous folding. Detective questions intensify. Hold course. Trust me. It bore Lizzie's looping script. Emma's thoughts churned. Lizzie had always been the stronger one, sharp of tongue, swift of will. When their mother died, Lizzie had filled the void with fierce devotion. When father grew cold, Lizzie warmed Emma's nights with stories and promises that they, the spinster daughters, would carve out a place in a world built by men. Emma had believed her, but blood changed things. Blood soaked into joists and dreams, alike, turning them dark. And Emma was tired of whispers, tired of rooms that stank of death, tired of the taste of bile every time she heard a policeman knock. She reached into her bureau drawer and withdrew her diary, the one she hadn't opened since the murders. The pen wobbled between her fingers. If I write it down, she thought, does that make it real? Lightning flashed, and for a moment the room turned stark white. In that instant she imagined Abby on the floor and father in his chair, both staring at her with eyeless accusation. The pen touched paper. Lizzie stood at the upstairs window, watching streaks of silver carve the night. When lightning lit the glass, her reflection glared back, hair perfect, lips taut, eyes ablaze. She told herself she felt no fear, only irritation. In another week the commotion would pass, the constables would chase fresh scandal, and she and Emma would settle the estate on their terms. The house creaked behind her. She turned, nothing there but shadows. Still, a chill pricked her neck. She closed the drapes and paced, counting steps like a metronome. 12 from wall to wall, 12. Back again. She recited scripture under her breath, verses of judgment and inheritance, and convinced herself the storm outside was worse than any trouble brewing within. Yet every boom of thunder sounded to her ear like a gavel striking wood. At 10:30, Bridget slipped back through the servant's door. Her clothes were damp, her boots muddied. She listened. She climbed a back stair as carefully as a thief, each step its own prayer. Reaching her attic room, she latched the door. Only then did she let her knees give way. She had done it. The secret was out. Part of her felt lighter, as if she'd placed a millstone into Mallory's hands. But fear rushed in to fill the vacancy, fear of Lizzie's wrath, fear of a courtroom, fear of standing in front of strangers who'd dissect her accent, her faith, her very worthiness to speak. She pressed her palms together until nails bit flesh. St. Bridget, give me courage, she whispered into the hush, then crawled beneath the thin quilt. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Miles away, Mallory left the boarding house with Bridget's testimony secure in his breast pocket. He splashed through puddles toward the station, hat brim leaking rivulets. In the lightning he looked dogged and lean, a man chasing the tail of something venomous through a raging sea. Tomorrow he would speak with the district attorney. Tomorrow he would subpoena Emma. Tomorrow he would deliver the letter from Cork, the testimony, the witness accounts, the inconsistencies in Lizzie's story, and the faint traces of blood still hiding in the fibers of a dress burned too late. Tonight, he carried only purpose and the unsettling sense that storms, once invited, do not icily leave. Thunder cracked again. Somewhere in the rattling heavens he thought he heard a laugh, sharp, feminine, defiant, or perhaps it was only wind slicing past chimneys. Either way he quickened his pace. The edge of confession had been reached. Now came the fall or the climb. The storm broke by morning. Rain still clung to the gutters, and the cobblestones wore a sheen of reflection, but the skies had calmed. Fall River woke to the scent of earth and Asherworld, scrubbed but not cleansed. In the Hennessy house, the air smelled of damp wood and lavender polish, as if Lizzie were trying to perfume away something deeper. Bridget rose before dawn. Her eyes were sore, her body stiff, but her decision had not wavered. She had crossed a threshold last night, and there was no going back. As she dressed, the creak of the stairs warned her. Lizzie was already up. That wasn't surprising. Lizzie had always been an early riser, but today, the timing felt strategic. Bridget descended carefully, keeping her expression flat. In the kitchen, Lizzie stood beside the stove, stirring oatmeal with the ease of a woman pretending nothing was wrong. Did you sleep well? Lizzie asked, without turning. Well enough. Strange dreams. Lizzie inquired, finally glancing over her shoulder. This house has always made people dream oddly. Bridget said nothing. She reached for a clean cloth and began drying. The dishes still damped from last night. I dreamt of the sea, Lizzie said softly, of being adrift. A small boat, no oars, just drifting. The strangest part, Bridget, she smiled faintly. I wasn't afraid. The silence that followed was long. Then you were out late last night. Bridget stiffened. I went to the grocer, she said too quickly. We were out of soap, were we? Lizzie murmured. I suppose I hadn't noticed, but she had. Of course she had. Lizzie noticed everything. Detective Mallory sat with the district attorney by 9 a.m. Every note, transcript, and witness statement laid out before them in tidy, damning order. Harrison Knowlton was a bulldog of a prosecutor, broad-shouldered, stiff-jawed, and possessed of a moral clarity that bordered on religious fervor. He read the letter from Bridget's sister aloud, then reread her transcribed testimony in silence. When he finished, he looked up. It's enough. Barely, Mallory replied. We're threading a needle. Thread it, Knowlton said. Bring the charges. I want the indictment drawn today. What about Emma? Subpoena her. She cracks. The case explodes. If she doesn't, we still have Bridget, and we lean into motive. Mallory tapped his pen. I don't think Lizzie will break, but I think she's about to start running out of script. Then let's make sure the curtain falls before she finds a new one. That afternoon, a uniformed officer delivered a sealed notice to the Hennessy house. Lizzie accepted it without flinching. What's this? Emma asked from the stairwell. Lizzie didn't answer. She stepped into the drawing room, shut the door, and opened the envelope. A summons. A formal indictment. She was to appear in court the following week, charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree. Lizzie stood motionless, eyes scanning the fine print, fingers tightening at the edges. The letter crinkled slightly in her grip, the paper whispering like a nervous conspirator. So it had begun. She turned and found Emma in the doorway. You knew this was coming, Lizzie said. Emma blinked. No, I didn't. You've been talking to someone I haven't. Lying doesn't suit you. I'm not the one on trial. There it was. The fracture. Lizzie inhaled through her nose, slow and cold. Don't forget, Emma. If I fall, you fall too. Emma's eyes welled. You said they wouldn't suspect. That it would end with mourning veils and inheritance papers. It still can. No, Lizzie. Her voice cracked. It can't. Not anymore. Bridget, polishing the front banister with trembling fingers, heard every word. She didn't mean to listen, didn't want to. But in this house, eavesdropping was a survival skill. And what she heard shook her to her bones. Emma knew. Emma had always known. She'd just hidden behind Lizzie like ivy on a wall, waiting for someone else to yank the roots free. Bridget set the cloth down. Her hands were slick with sweat. Her breath came shallow. She didn't know if Lizzie would explode or crumble, but she did know one thing. When desperate people were cornered, they bit. That evening, Lizzie dined alone. Emma stayed in her room. Bridget made her excuses. The roast remained mostly untouched, congealing beneath the chandelier's weak glow. Lizzie sat there for nearly an hour, slicing her meat into smaller and smaller pieces. A forkful would rise, hover near her mouth, then lower again. Her gaze wandered to the framed photograph above the fireplace. Her father, stern-eyed and commanding, standing beside Abby, whose expression was caught halfway between propriety and fatigue. Murder had changed many things, but not those faces. Not yet, and that was what enraged her most. They still looked so smug. Later that night, Bridget heard footsteps on the landing, quick, deliberate. She cracked her door open slightly and saw Lizzie descending toward the cellar, her shawl wrapped tight, something tucked beneath her arm. Bridget followed, soundless as mist. The cellar door creaked open, then shut, down the servants' stair. Around the corner. Bridget reached the door and leaned in. Inside, Lizzie knelt beside the furnace. She pulled the bundle from under her arm, an old pair of gloves, a handkerchief, and something else, a woman's brooch, crusted with a fleck of dried blood. Abby's brooch. Bridget stifled a gasp. Lizzie fed them into the fire. One by one, her face lit by flickers of orange and red. She watched the flames consume with the cold satisfaction of someone deleting pages from a diary. When the brooch was gone, she sat there, staring into the coals. Then she whispered something. Bridget strained to hear. I should have done it sooner, and the voice barely audible, almost childlike, added, I'm not sorry. At 2:15 a.m., Emma crept into the hallway. Bridget, still awake, watched from the shadows. Emma clutched her journal like a lifeline, her white nightgown trailing across the floor. She paused outside Lizzie's door. Her hand rose, hesitated, then dropped. Instead of knocking, she slipped into the study and shut the door behind her. Bridget crept down the stairs. Inside the study, Emma sat at the writing desk. She opened her journal, dipped her pen, and began to write fast. Frantic. I think she'll kill me next. She burned the last of the evidence tonight. I know what she did. I should have stopped her, but I didn't. I was too afraid, too tired, too loyal. But if I vanish, if I'm found in the river or the attic or gone without a trace, no, it wasn't an accident. She's capable of anything now. She closed the book, blew out the lamp, and returned to her room without a sound. Bridget stayed there long after, staring at the door. The pages Emma had written might be the only thing between her and another scream in the dark. At dawn, Mallory received confirmation of the indictment's approval. He stared at the arrest order, felt its weight, and whispered to himself, "Time to end this." He pinned the badge to his coat, checked his sidearm, and stepped out into a town that still hadn't decided what it believed but was about to find out. Fall River awoke with the scent of fresh bread, inked headlines, and a quiet unease that settled over the cobblestones like morning mist. Children walked to school slower that day. Shopkeepers eyed their ledgers with distracted fingers, and at the Hennessy house on 2nd Street, the calm was anything but comforting. Detective Mallory arrived just before 8. He didn't come alone. A uniformed officer trailed him, tall and red-faced with a folded warrant clutched in one hand like it was still hot from the judge's desk. They stepped through the wrought iron gate, boots clicking with intention. They didn't pause to admire the rose bushes or the ivy curling up the brick. This was not a courtesy call. Inside the house, Lizzie stood in the front parlor, already dressed for the day in a crisp navy walking dress, her collar perfectly stiff, her eyes unreadable. When the constable announced them, she nodded once. "I've been expecting you," she said, voice smooth as ever. Mallory removed his hat. "Elizabeth Hennessy," he said calmly. "You are under arrest for the murders of Andrew Hennessy and Abigail Hennessy. You'll be remanded for arraignment this afternoon in New Bedford." Bridget, who had been folding linens in the dining room, froze. Emma, upstairs, felt the moment in her bones before she heard a word. "And Lizzie." Lizzie smiled. "Of course," she said. "Allow me a moment to gather my gloves." They let her dress in private, though Mallory followed her down the hallway like a quiet shadow. She chose grey gloves, soft leather, unblemished. When she emerged, she paused by the foyer mirror, adjusted her hat, and turned to Bridget, who stood stiff and pale at the base of the stairs. "We won't let them break us," Lizzie said, her gaze pinning Bridget in place. "They'll try, but we are not weak." Bridget couldn't speak. Her lips moved, but nothing came out. Lizzie smiled faintly. "I forgive you," she said, and walked past her into custody. The headlines hit the street by noon. Lizzie Hennessy, arrested for axe murders, local maid to TSDFY, was the story Fall River had both feared and hoped for. The tragedy of a high-born daughter accused, a scandal of a respected family crumbling in public view. By midday, crowds had formed outside the courthouse in New Bedford. Reporters jostled. Sketch artists fought for angles. Every woman in town had an opinion. Every man had a theory. Inside a carriage rattling toward the courthouse, Lizzie sat between the detective and the constable, hands gloved, eyes distant. "They'll make a theater of this," she said absently. "Even the judge will play a role. I wonder what costume they'll give me. Monster, martyr, no costume," Mallory replied. "Just truth." She turned her gaze to him. "Truth is made by whoever has the louder voice." Back at the house, silence pressed in on Bridget like a closing hand. Emma had not come downstairs since the arrest. When Bridget knocked gently at her door, there was no answer, only the creak of floorboards and the rustle of paper. The dining room still held the ghost of breakfast. Half a teacup, a spoon left askew, butter softening on a plate no one would finish. Bridget cleared it all away, but the air felt heavier than the dishes in her arms. Her confession had set something in motion, a great, grinding wheel of justice or ruin, but she did not feel free. She felt exposed. 1ORED. Later that afternoon, she was summoned to the station for a sworn statement. She walked there alone. The room was small and plain, but every corner echoed. "State your name," said a clerk at the far table. "Bridget." "O'Malley. Occupation, domestic servant." "Do you understand that you are testifying under oath?" "I do." And then came the questions. Again. "What time did you hear the first scream? Where exactly was Lizzie standing when you saw her? What words did she use? Did she hold the weapon? What was her tone?" Each answer chipped away at her composure, but she did not falter. When the final page of the transcript was signed, Mallory escorted her out into the twilight. He didn't speak for a while, neither did she. Then, as they reached the edge of the courthouse steps, he turned to her. "You did the right thing." Bridget gave a faint nod. She hate me forever. Let her, he said. She'll be doing it from a cell. In the courtroom, Lizzie's arraignment was conducted swiftly. She pleaded not guilty. Her attorney, a former governor of Massachusetts, a motion to dismiss. The judge overruled it. Bail was denied. She would remain in custody pending trial. Her face did not change, but as she was led away, she looked back not at the judge, not at the reporters, but at the single person seated in the last row of the courtroom. Emma. Their eyes met. A second passed. Then Lizzie smiled, and Emma quiet-eyed. Emma turned her head away. That night, the house was too quiet. Bridget returned after sunset. She set a kettle on the stove and lit the lamp. The flame fluttered uncertainly, casting long shadows. She felt the silence like a pressure behind her ears, like the sea waiting to pull her under. She climbed to the second floor and paused outside Emma's room. Inside, she found her sitting at the vanity, unmoving. "Are you well, miss?" Emma's reflection met hers in the mirror. "I think I've never really been well," she said softly. "I've just pretended better than most." Bridget moved toward her. "I don't believe you're like her." Emma smiled faintly. "Don't you?" "I do." She reached into the drawer and pulled out a small notebook. Her diary. "I wrote it down," she said. "All of it. Maybe someday someone will read it and understand why we did what we did, why silence felt safer than justice." Bridget took the diary gently, surprised she'd been trusted with it. "She'd say I knew everything," Emma added, "that I planned it, but I didn't. I stood by. That's all I stood by. And now," Emma's eyes brimmed, "now, I wish I hadn't." Down in the cellar, the furnace was cold, but ashes still told stories. Charred leather, a twisted pin, flecks of soot embedded in brick. Detective Mallory would return the next day to collect them. He already had the rest: motive, opportunity, testimony, timeline. But what he needed most, what he hoped would finally break through the jury's doubt, was Lizzie's own mask cracking in front of 12 strangers. If that failed, Bridget's courage would have to carry the weight of 2 deaths, 2 lives, and 1 courtroom's judgment. Upstairs, alone in her room, Bridget read the first page of Emma's diary. "I never imagined it would come to this, but I also never imagined what we were capable of. And once you imagine such things once, you name them, they begin to feel like destiny." She closed the book, and in the silence, she prayed for the first time, not for safety, but for strength. Lizzie Hennessy adjusted the stiff collar of her prison uniform, each movement slow and deliberate, as though she were donning a gown for Sunday Mass, rather than sitting in a stone-walled cell where the only audience was the shadow of her own reputation. The county jail was nothing like her drawing room. The air here was heavy with rust, sweat, and stale bread. Gone were the polished floors and French wallpaper. The only scent now was limestone and the iron tang of old rage. But Lizzie bore it with eerie calm. Even now, locked behind bars and labeled a murderess, she kept her spine straight, her chin high, and her lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't quite regret either. The matron eyed her with suspicion. "She don't blink," she muttered to the younger guard, "like she's waiting for the curtains to rise." "She's used to the stage," he whispered back. "Let's hope she forgets her lines." In Fall River, the trial had yet to begin, but its presence had infected the town like a fever. Coffee houses buzzed with gossip. Barbers sharpened razors between debates. Church ladies met for tea just to discuss the devil's fingerprints on fine society. Some whispered that Bridget had fabricated everything, that the Irish girl was jealous, vengeful, perhaps even in love with Mr. Hennessy herself. Others believed Lizzie's coolness was proof. No one that calm could be innocent. In every pew and parlor, people chose sides. And in the center of it all stood Emma, caught between truth and loyalty, unable to silence the slow unraveling within her. She had not left the house in days. Bridget noticed the difference immediately. Emma no longer brushed her hair or changed her gown. Meals went untouched. The drawing room smelled of stale perfume and paper, but what worried Bridget most was the silence. Emma had stopped humming, stopped reading aloud, stopped even pacing. She simply sat. It was on the 3rd evening after Lizzie's arrest that Bridget found her at the window, diary open on her lap, one sentence written over and over: "If I had screamed, would they still be dead?" Bridget approached quietly. "You can still speak now." Miss Emma didn't turn to who? The lawyers, the police, God, to yourself. Emma gave a soft, bitter laugh. "I stopped listening to myself the day Abby was killed." Bridget hesitated. "They may ask you to testify." "I know, and if they do..." Emma closed the diary. "Then, I suppose I'll decide whether I'm a coward or a witness." At the courthouse, Mallory reviewed the case again. Every scrap of evidence, every hole in Lizzie's story, every moment that didn't align, there were gaps. Still places where the narrative frayed, but Bridget's testimony and the physical evidence tied enough knots to hold it together. Barely. But juries weren't swayed by logic. Alone they needed theater, emotion, someone real, to bring the story to life. That someone was Bridget. And maybe if fate favored justice. Emma too. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived like a foghorn blast. Sudden, cold, impossible to ignore. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. Sketch artists with charcoal-stained fingers jostled for position. Police held back a crowd thick with shawls, hats, and pointed fingers. Bridget arrived in a borrowed coat, hands shaking in the pockets. She had never stood in a courtroom before, never addressed strangers with notepads and expectations. She could barely breathe, but when Mallory met her at the door and offered a nod of reassurance, she forced her legs forward. Inside, the courtroom was all polished oak and stern faces. Lizzie sat at the defense table, a portrait of poise, her hands folded in her lap as though she were awaiting tea, not a potential life sentence. Her eyes scanned the room, and found Bridget. For a moment, neither moved. Then Lizzie gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledgement, or warning. When Bridget took the stand, the room shifted. Her small frame and thick accent, the modesty in her dress, the trembling in her hands, it made her seem fragile, almost too delicate to hold such a story. But when she spoke, something in her voice struck the walls. "I saw her," she said. "I saw Miss Lizzie with the axe. She was standing over her stepmother's body. Her dress was stained, her face. It was calm, like this had been coming." The judge leaned forward. "Did she say anything?" Bridget swallowed hard. She said, "She took what wasn't hers. And now she'll never take anything again." Gasps rose from the benches. A pencil snapped. Someone dropped their handkerchief. Lizzie never blinked. The defense attorney rose with a creditor's grace. "Miss O'Malley," he said with polite venom, "how long have you worked for the Hennessy?" "For years. And in that time, were you ever mistreated?" Bridget hesitated. "No, never. Underpaid, overworked, treated with disdain because of your nationality." I don't know." "So you were content." "I did my work, and yet, here you are, accusing your employer of murder. Might that suggest some resentment?" "I didn't lie," Bridget said, voice stronger now, "and no one else saw this scene." "No. So it's your word alone." She lifted her chin. "Yes, but it's the truth." Outside the courthouse, the press exploded. Maid testifies. To Hennessy, bloodshed. Lizzie, stone-faced during shocking SDATM on Setram, was whisked out the back entrance and sent home by carriage. Her face pale, her fingers clenched tight around the folded gloves in her lap. She had told the truth, but she'd never felt so hollow, back in the jail. Lizzie sat alone in her cell as her lawyer reviewed the morning's damage. "She's good," he muttered. "Too good." Lizzie said nothing. "They'll eat her up," he added. "You'll be the cold one. She's the lamb." "She's not a lamb," Lizzie said quietly. "She's a matchstick." And someone lit her. That night, Emma found Bridget by the kitchen stove, arms wrapped around herself like a child in a thunderstorm. "I heard them talking," Emma said. Bridget turned. "The press? No. The lawyers. They're asking if I'll take the stand." Bridget's heart leaped. "Will you?" Emma paused. "Do you want me to?" "I want the truth. Nothing else." Emma looked away. "The truth is, I let her do it. I let it happen. That's what keeps me from sleeping." "You didn't swing the axe?" "No," Emma whispered, "but I left the door open." Up in her jail cell, Lizzie finally closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come, but silence did. She welcomed it, for now, because tomorrow the trial would begin in earnest, and if Fall River wanted a show, she would give them one. The mask was cracked, yes, but she still had the mirror, and in the mirror Lizzie Hennessy still saw herself not as a killer, but as the woman who refused to lose. The courthouse smelled of sweat, ink, and old pine when the trial of Elizabeth Hennessy officially began. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, but its warmth could not cut through the chill of anticipation. The courtroom was full to bursting, newspaper men hunched over pads, local matrons gripping rosaries, businessmen pretending to read ledgers while eavesdropping on whispered speculations. 12 jurors sat stiff and expressionless, chosen after hours of questions about morality, memory, and murder. All men, all white, all trying, poorly, to hide the curiosity that flickered behind their solemn eyes. At precisely 9 a.m., Lizzie Hennessy entered through the side door in her navy frock and grey gloves, head held high. She looked not like a woman accused of killing her father and stepmother, but like someone attending a matinee performance of her own trial. Her attorney followed close behind her, practiced gentleman with silver-rimmed spectacles and the calm air of someone who had built a career making uncomfortable truths disappear. Detective Mallory, seated near the back, didn't look away from Lizzie for a second. She's still playing to the crowd, he muttered. But what she didn't know was that the crowd had changed. The prosecution began with deliberate steps. Harrison Knowlton rose, like a mountain in a starched vest, and opened his argument with the weight of thunder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice measured, "we are not here because of speculation. We are here because two people were murdered in cold blood, in their home, in the early hours of a summer morning. And we are here because the person who stood to gain the most from their deaths emotionally, financially, and personally, Elizabeth Hennessy." He paused. "She did not cry when they died. She did not run when she found them. She lied. She delayed. She burned evidence. And now, when the truth threatens to undo her, she smiles." All eyes turned to Lizzie. She blinked once, then crossed her legs. Knowlton called his first witnesses, the constables, the coroner, the neighbors. Each painted the picture. The broken timepiece on the parlor wall, the blood spatter on the hallway, the missing axe handle, the odd calm in Lizzie's voice when she greeted the police. "She offered tea," said one officer. "She asked if we'd like a seat while she explained the scene." I remember thinking, this ain't how grief looks. By the time Bridget was called, the courtroom was holding its breath. She took the stand, hands folded in her lap, eyes lowered until the judge instructed her to speak. "Tell us what you saw," Knowlton prompted, and she did. Again. For the fourth time in public, Bridget told her story. The scream, the sound of a body hitting wood, the way Lizzie had stood by the stairs, blood on her apron, voice steady. The threat whispered at her later, "They'll believe the Irish girl did it, not me." This time, her voice did not tremble. And when Knowlton asked, "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" she said, "I was afraid of the police, of the people, of Miss Lizzie, but mostly of silence. Because silence is a choice too, and I'd been choosing it too long." A stir rippled across the room. Knowlton nodded. "Thank you." Then the defense rose. Cross-examination was a blade, and Lizzie's attorney wielded it with practiced elegance. "You say you saw her with blood on her apron," he began. "Did you see her strike the blow?" "No." "Then it's assumption." "I saw the body, I saw the axe, I saw her hands, but not the act itself." Bridget hesitated. "No," he paced. "You'd worked for the Hennessys for years. Did you ever see Miss Lizzie behave violently?" "No." "Ever see her threaten anyone?" "No." "Did she treat you well?" Bridget bit her lip, as well as most do, meaning she paid. She spoke civilly, "But she didn't see me." "You mean she didn't befriend you?" "I mean she didn't notice me until I knew something." The room held its breath again. The defense attorney frowned. "So this testimony of yours, it's justice, or revenge?" Bridget raised her chin. "It's the truth." That answer rang harder than anything that came after. When Emma was called to testify, the courtroom shifted again. All eyes darted toward the eldest Hennessy, daughter, pale, reserved, wrapped in black like a woman mourning something more than just her father. She took the stand with trembling fingers. "Miss Hennessy," Knowlton began gently, "you've heard your sister accused. You've read the reports. You've lived in that house. Did you see anything that led you to believe Lizzie was capable of this crime?" Emma's lip quivered. There was a long pause. Then, softly, "Yes," gasps, scribbled notes. A reporter fainted, or pretended to. Knowlton nodded. "Can you tell the court what you observed?" "I saw her after the murders. She didn't cry, she cleaned, she made tea, she ironed gloves. I heard her in the cellar the next night burning things, and I asked her, God help me. I asked her, God help me. What's done is done. Don't dig it up." Emma's voice cracked. "She told me that if I loved her, I'd stay quiet, and I did." "Why are you speaking now?" Emma blinked tears. "Because silence didn't save anyone." When court recessed, Lizzie was escorted out through a side hallway, chin high, stride unbroken. But inside, a storm had begun. She didn't look at Emma, didn't speak, didn't blink, only clenched her gloved fists, because now she knew. They had broken rank. Bridget had stabbed from below. Emma had betrayed from beside. And in this theater of judgment, the only role left for her to play was villain that night. Thunder returned. Bridget sat by the parlor window. Emma upstairs again, the house too empty for its size. "What happens now?" Bridget whispered to herself. Outside, lanterns flickered. Inside, the quiet was sharp enough to cut. She didn't know if the jury would believe them, didn't know if justice was possible, but for the first time since the murders, The house didn't feel like it was suffocating her. It just felt still. At the jail, Lizzie refused dinner. She sat on her cot, staring at the wall. A rat scurried near the corner. She didn't move, didn't scream, didn't blink. She simply whispered. Under her breath, "They think they've won." And the cell echoed back, "Nothing at all." 12 men sat boxed in by oak panels and heavy silence. They were farmers, clerks, and shopkeepers, ordinary men with cracked hands and sunburnt necks. But for this brief stretch of time, they were gods. Their verdict would carve history into stone, and though none of them had known Andrew or Abigail Hennessy personally, all of them knew of them, their wealth, their daughters, their murder. And now, they knew Lizzie. The courtroom had become a theater, yes, but the jury. They were the audience in the final curtain call, and each man carried his own private ghosts to his seat. One had lost a wife to typhoid. Another remembered watching his brother be punished for a crime he didn't commit. A third still harbored quiet fury from a wealthy employer who docked his pay without cause. Justice, for all its blindfolded symbolism, never truly enters a room alone. Lizzie's defense began. Her attorney, Mr. Corbin, stepped forward. All polish and poise, the sort of man whose words landed with charm even when they cut. "We've heard stories," he began, "but not proof. We've heard emotions, not evidence. Let us return, gentlemen, to the simplest question in all of law. Did she do it?" He paced slowly. No weapon was found in her possession. No witness saw her commit the act. The maid says she saw blood on a dress, but blood is not guilt. Fear is not guilt. Reputation is not guilt. And being a strong, capable woman in a world frightened of both, that most certainly is not guilt. The jury listened. Corbin turned toward Lizzie and raised his hand slightly. "Tell them." Lizzie stood. The courtroom leaned forward as one. "I loved my father," she said simply. "I disagreed with him, yes, I argued. But love is not measured in obedience. It is measured in grief, and I have grieved." Her voice did not quaver. Her eyes scanned the jury. "I was raised to be strong, so I did not cry for the public. I did not fall apart. I handled the police with poise because I believed I had to, not because I had something to hide." She clasped her hands together. "My sister has betrayed me. Our maid has misremembered events under pressure, but I have told no lies." She stepped back. The courtroom was silent. The defense then introduced character witnesses, church members, a music teacher, a woman Lizzie had once donated gloves to during a blizzard. They spoke of her kindness, her discipline, her generosity. One tearfully recounted how Lizzie had helped fund her daughter's medicine during a long illness. "She's not a killer," the woman said. "She's a lady." It was a phrase that echoed oddly in the wood-paneled room. "She's a lady." In the gallery, Emma shifted. She sat alone, though not by choice. After her testimony, her name had become a whisper. Ladies she once dined with now crossed the street. The family lawyer no longer returned her letters. She had broken a code, one older and darker than blood, but she felt lighter, tainted, perhaps, but finally clean. Still, when Lizzie met her eyes across the courtroom, Emma could not hold the gaze. She looked down at her hands, then at Bridget, who sat 2 rows back, eyes damp but unblinking. Their truth had been told. Whether it mattered was no longer theirs to decide. The closing arguments came like waves, crashing against each other, and fury, logic and fire. Knowlton reminded the jury that motive and opportunity were threads in every crime, that no one else had reason, that silence was its own kind of scream, that Bridget's story never wavered, that Emma had nothing to gain, and everything to lose by speaking. Corbin countered with charm and doubt. He called the accusations a convenient storm. He leaned on words like plausible deniability and circumstantial at best. He painted Lizzie as a symbol of misunderstood womanhood, persecuted for ambition. When he finished, Lizzie offered the jury a final look. Soft, controlled, untouchable, untouchable. Judge instructed the jury with solemn words and well-worn metaphors. The law does not ask you to feel, it asks you to weigh. You must set aside rumor, anger, sympathy. You must decide only this. Has guilt been proven beyond a reasonable doubt? And then, they were dismissed. The jury vanished behind the door. The courtroom waited outside. The sky began to bruise purple with dusk. Inside, hearts pounded like war. Drums. It took 7 hours. 7 long, heavy, whispered hours. Bridget paced. Emma prayed. Corbin chewed his lip. Mallory didn't move. When the jury returned, the room inhaled and held it. The foreman, a short man with calloused fingers and a twitch in his eye, handed the folded verdict to the bailiff. The bailiff passed it to the judge. The judge opened it, scanned the lines, and nodded once. He turned to the courtroom. In the matter of the Commonwealth versus Elizabeth Hennessy, a hush like snow falling. We, the jury, find the defendant. Every heart in the room skipped. Not guilty. Chaos. One woman fainted. A man shouted, "She strike again." Someone else cried, "Justice has died." Emma went pale. Bridget let out a strangled gasp and gripped the bench. Lizzie, she closed her eyes and smiled. Corbin leaned over. "Don't react too much." Lizzie whispered, "Oh, I won't." But inside, "I'm standing." Later, as she exited through the side hall, reporters swarmed. "Miss Hennessy, how do you feel? Will you return to Fall River? Do you believe justice was served?" She paused at the threshold, looked into the blinding flash of bulbs and charcoal sketch pads, and said softly, "I believe truth is often quieter than lies." And today, it spoke just loud enough. She walked away, coat swirling like the last act of a play. Back at the house, Bridget packed her things. She couldn't stay. Not now. Not under that roof. Emma helped silently. "You could come with me," Bridget offered. Emma shook her head. "I belong here at least. For a while. Someone has to haunt this place." They embraced, brief, tired, forgiving. And then, Bridget left, stepping into a future she could not yet see but had chosen for herself. Lizzie did return to Fall River. Briefly. She did not host guests. She did not speak to the press. Again, some said she took up work for a women's reform society. Others claimed she moved to Providence under a new name. But one fact held: she never faced trial again, and she never confessed. History is not always made of guilt and punishment. Sometimes, it is made of silence, finely dressed and smiling in the face of the gallows, and sometimes, the truth doesn't win, it just survives. 2 weeks after her acquittal, Elizabeth Hennessy returned to the house on 2nd Street like a shadow creeping back into its corner. She arrived without fanfare. No carriage paragi, no smiling crowds. Just a single black trunk, a worn leather satchel, and a driver paid not to ask questions. The windows were shut. The ivy had begun to curl away from the walls, as if even nature had grown cautious. Inside, the house was cold, not from weather, but from vacancy. Furniture sat untouched, dusting itself in stillness. The air smelled of old perfume and fading scandal. She stood in the doorway, gloved fingers brushing the handle like she wasn't sure if it was her home anymore or a mausoleum she'd inherited by force. For all her performance in court measured, elegant, unflinching, this was the stage Lizzie feared most. Silence with no audience. Rooms without applause. Emma sat at the piano. She did not turn when Lizzie entered. The notes under her fingers were soft and dissonant, an unfinished lullaby trying to find its way through grief. She kept playing even when Lizzie crossed the parlor floor and stood beside her, close enough to feel her breath. "You came back," Emma said flatly. "This is still my home." Emma let the music stop. "No," she whispered. "It was Father's home, then it was ours. But now it belongs to ghosts." Lizzie lowered herself into the chair across from her sister. "And whose fault is that?" Emma met her eyes. "For the first time in weeks, I stopped protecting you." A pause. "You started protecting yourself," Lizzie corrected. "There's a difference." That night, Fall River buzzed. Candles flickered in windows. Gossip rustled louder than leaves. Word of Lizzie's return spread through bakeries, barber shops, and behind lace-curtained parlors like fire. No one confronted her directly. No protest formed on the lawn, but her presence was an unease wrapped in velvet. Children were told to cross the street before her corner. Old men spat when her name came up at the tavern. And the reverend who once shook her hand after every Sunday sermon avoided eye contact at the grocer's. Lizzie felt none of it, or pretended to. Bridget, now settled in the nearby town of Taunton, heard about the return in the middle of folding laundry at a boarding house. The landlady, reading from a newspaper, muttered, "That devil girl's back." Bridget's hand stilled. She looked out the window at a quiet street lined with sycamores. Nothing like 2nd Street's stone facades, but the cold that ran down her spine felt familiar. It was the same chill that crept through the Hennessy hallway after midnight. The same one that lived in the cellar. "She always comes back," she whispered to herself, even when she shouldn't. In the following days, Lizzie took up routine like armor. She walked the garden path each morning, gloves always on, spine rigid as iron. She cleaned her father's study herself, letting the servants go. She burned old ledgers, unread letters, and Abby's embroidery hoops, quietly reclaiming the space by erasing what once softened it. She didn't speak to Emma much. They moved around each other like clock hands ticking on separate hours. But on the 5th day, as Lizzie was trimming dead leaves from the rose bushes, Emma stepped out onto the porch with 2 cups of tea. "I had a dream," she said, offering one to Lizzie. Lizzie raised an eyebrow. Another one. Emma nodded. Little again. You were hiding under father's desk, pretending the floor was lava. I tried to pull you out, and you scratched me. You didn't want to be saved. Lizzie took the cup. I still don't. Emma sipped quietly. I think I did. For a long time, wanting to save you. But now, I think I was just trying to save myself through you. They didn't speak again for a while, but the silence between them was different now, not tense, not sharp. Just hollow, like two women learning how to live. In an echo at the courthouse, Detective Mallory sat hunched over a collection of notes he refused to file away. The trial was over, the verdict final, but the story haunted him. Something about it wouldn't close. The evidence had always circled, not pointed, and Lizzie's smile, even in victory, had carried something he recognized too well. Control, not relief, not innocence, controlled. He lit a match, burned a copy of the final deposition, and watched the flame curl the pages like a memory folding into itself. We never really had her, he said aloud. Only her shadow. Lizzie began receiving letters, some anonymous, some threatening. One simply read, "We know." She kept them all in a drawer. She never replied. One morning, Emma found Lizzie sitting at the kitchen table with a half-written note. In front of her and a list of names, banks, societies, distant cousins. You leaving? Lizzie looked up. I'm considering it. Where would you go? Europe. Maybe Boston, a place where people forget faster. Emma sat across from her. You're free now, you know, truly. The world already believes what it wants. I'm not running, no. But you're not staying either. Lizzie tapped her pen. Some houses rot too deep to rebuild. Emma smiled sadly. And yet, you keep tending the garden. Before she left, Lizzie visited the graves. She went alone, wore her best gloves, carried no flowers, just stood there, one stone for Andrew, another for Abigail, etched in grey and sunlight. The grass was the squirrel darted across the plot. Wind tugged gently at her coat. She spoke no words, only looked, and in her stillness, the whole weight of what had been done, what had been hidden, hung between her and the earth like a locked trunk no one dared to dig up. She stayed 5 minutes, then left, never looking back. 2 days later, she boarded a train under a borrowed name. Her luggage was light. She carried no photos, no mementos, only gloves. Always the gloves. Emma remained in the house. She opened windows for the first time in weeks, let air sweep through the corridors, replaced Lizzie's tea tins with herbs, painted over the cellar door. She did not try to forget, but she stopped, whispering. And that was enough. History would go on to debate the Hennessy murders for decades. Some would write articles, some would publish books, names would be changed, timelines questioned. Emma would grow old and vague, refusing interviews. Bridget would live a modest life, never giving another statement. And Lizzie would become a ghost in her own lifetime, unseen, but never truly gone, because some verdicts don't end with the gavel, they echo. And some women, once touched by blood and flame, do not vanish, they become myth. Years passed. The house on 2nd Street stood like a stubborn memory, brick by brick, shudder by shudder, refusing to fall, refusing to speak. Emma remained its sole keeper. By now, vines had crept deeper into the eaves. The wallpaper curled. At the corners, floorboards groaned louder in the winter. The laughter that once floated through its holes had long since faded. Even the air inside had changed, drier, older, as if it had learned not to expect visitors. People still walked by. Some quickened their steps. Others paused, staring up at the dusty windows as though they might catch a glimpse of something or someone inside. Children dared each other to touch the gate. None stayed long, and every few months, someone left flowers on the doorstep. Not for mourning. But for curiosity. For fear. For legend. Emma rarely left. Her world became small, measured in teaspoons and firewood, not hours or miles. She read old books, wrote letters she never mailed, and tended the roses because that's what Lizzie had once done. And somehow that small act made the silence bearable. But in her mind, she wandered constantly. She revisited the courtroom, the testimony, Bridget's eyes, her sister's voice saying, "Don't dig it up." She wondered, often, how things might have been if she had spoken sooner, or louder, or not at all. Regret is a companion that never ages. One autumn morning, Emma received a letter. It came without a return address, sealed in wax so dark it looked like dried blood. Inside a single line, "You still have her mirror, don't you?" Emma dropped the paper. She hadn't touched the mirror in years. It was stored in the attic, swaddled in a linen shroud, leaning against a trunk full of her mother's gowns. She had forgotten about it, or had tried to. That night, she climbed to the attic with a candle. It was still there, untouched, cold. When she pulled back the cloth, her face stared back at her, older now, thinner, but still unmistakably a Hennessy. She expected her reflection to look haunted. Instead, it looked expectant. The next day she wrote a letter to Bridget. She didn't ask how she was, didn't apologize, simply wrote, "There are questions I'm still afraid to answer, but I'd like to see you again, not as a maid, not as a witness, as someone who knows what it means to carry silence." She sealed it with trembling hands. For the first time in years, Emma stepped beyond the garden gate and walked to the post. Bridget received the letter on a Tuesday. She read it under a sycamore tree while hanging linens to dry. The words gripped her not with guilt, but something else. Recognition. She had long since rebuilt a life. Small, quiet, honest. She worked in a boarding house, tended to sick neighbors, attended church on Sundays. People knew her as dependable. No one asked her about the Hennessys anymore. But not a night went by when she didn't hear the thud of footsteps on stairs, the echo of blood dripping. The way Lizzie had smiled like justice was something she could shape with her hands. Bridget folded the letter carefully and placed it beneath her pillow. She didn't write back, but she didn't throw it away either. Elsewhere, miles away, maybe Oceansill Elizabeth Hennessy lived behind other names. Eliza Harland. Miss Bettridge. Mrs. Winslow. In Boston, she was a benefactor to women's causes. In Paris, she was rumored to host literary salons. In Chicago, she was seen with a banker who mysteriously disappeared after a year-long engagement. She never stayed long. Always left behind perfume and rumor, never a body. One winter, a journalist tried to find her. He was young, bold, eager to publish something that would make his name. He tracked old bank records, cross-referenced ship manifests, interviewed anyone who had ever spoken her name. He found nothing solid, only the same words: charming, frightening, sharp as ice, unnatural calm. The kind of woman who could convince you the world was flat, then push you off the edge. The journalist never published. He disappeared in Vermont. His notes were found in a hotel drawer, unfinished. On the last page, a scrawled line: "She doesn't just rewrite her past, she erases yours." Back in Fall River, the townspeople aged, died, moved, but the Hennessy name never did. It stayed, carved into stone and memory, part of every ghost story, every whispered cautionary tale. On stormy nights, some swore they saw a figure in the upper window, standing in the dark. Others said the house sighed. Some claimed the roses bloomed out of season vibrant red. Even in snow-tart, children said it was the blood. Adults didn't correct them. Emma's health began to falter. Her hands shook more. She forgot small things, dates, names, recipes. But she never forgot Lizzie's face, not even as her own memory blurred. Around it, she kept the mirror in her bedroom now. Sometimes she spoke to it, not expecting answers, just needing to hear her voice. On her final day, the maid found her sitting by the window, hands folded in her lap. The mirror beside her, the roses in full bloom. Below, her eyes were closed. She was smiling. The house was put up for sale. No one bought it, no matter how low the price. Even the realtors wouldn't step inside without someone else. They claimed it felt wrong. Too quiet, too aware. Years later, a novelist moved into town, chasing the bones of a story. She asked about the Hennessy sisters. A librarian handed her a thin file, yellow clippings. One photograph, a court drawing. "Most of it's gone," the librarian said, "but people still talk, whisper mostly, about what? That some murders never end." That night, the writer walked by the house on 2nd Street. The gate creaked, a curtain fluttered, and from an upper window she could have sworn someone was watching her. She smiled to herself. Whispers, after all, make the best stories, especially when no one remembers who whispered first.